So it's my honor to introduce or say hello, I guess, to Norman Zierold. I knew of him, but I really didn't know about him until I read his book. He would come into the library from time to time and always want to know about a certain author. Authors I didn't really know about. He was looking for autobiographies, biography, and I got a sense, well, that's interesting. He likes to read that. But I didn't realize that, that was a real connection to who he was and what he did professionally. So, welcome, Norman Zierold, and I'm going to extend the introduction a bit by reading about the author from your book. So that kind of covers a lot of bases. Norman Zierold was born in the Amana colonies of southeast Iowa in 1927 and spent his young years in that simple, picturesque community until his enlistment in the United States Navy. The GI Bill of Rights then led Norman to Harvard, where he graduated cum laude, and on to the University of Iowa, where he earned a master's degree in English literature. 2 halcyon years in Bordeaux and Paris on a French government teaching assistantship were followed by an exciting decade in New York City, where he taught at the prestigious Brearley School and served on Collier's Encyclopedia before landing rewarding assignments with Theater Arts Magazine and Show. Inevitably, as he had always planned, Norman began to write professionally. He has since published several books, including Garbo, The Child Stars, The Moguls, and Sex Goddesses of the Silent Screen, as well as 2 true crime accounts, Little Charlie Rose and 3 Sisters in Black, which garnered a special Edgar Allan Poe Award from the Mystery Writers of America. Along the way, Norman met celebrities galore, including Barbara Walters, Andy Warhol, Mae West, Groucho Marx, Anais Nin, Tennessee Williams, Anthony Quinn, Rex Harrison, Shelley Winters, Carol Channing, and Jackie Coogan. In 1972, Norman added a keystone to the arch of his life story, beginning the practice of transcendental meditation, which he found so personally satisfying that he became a teacher and taught the technique to many hundreds of people. Since 2002, Norman has been living in Fairfield, where he works in the communications office at Maharishi University of Management. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, that sums it up. Thank you so much for coming.
So, this book comes from many different directions. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of this book? What was the...
Or some Italian word. Just always put in everything that occurs to you and don't censor yourself. Because what you do when you do that is you just... We talked for half an hour, Quinn and I, and then he said, well, I'm ready to go, if you are. And I said, well, I'd have to look at what you've got first. And he said, well, I've got 1,000 pages, and here they are. And he said, and we've got to turn them into 300. Well, I said, I'll let you know. I'll read them over the weekend. I read them, and it was just. And he said, by the way, my publisher, Little Brown, has had this manuscript for 20 years, and they don't know what to do with it because no one wants to read 1,000 pages, and no one knows what to do with it. And so I looked at it, and I saw immediately what to do with it. You cut. And so I would sit with Quinn, and he would look over my shoulder. And I would go like this, and then I'd cross out, and I'd see there was a repetition. He'd said that twice before already. So I'd cross it out. And then I would go on, and hopefully there'd be a little passage where I didn't have to cut anything out, and then I'd cut it out again. And this went on until I began to be, and I didn't hear a word from him, and you know, Quinn is half Irish and half Mexican, so I know there's a lot of macho there. I knew there was a lot of macho quality there, and here I was slashing. And finally one day, I had cut a great deal, and I was just turning the page, and he said, "Wait!" And so I turned it back, and instead of my cutting a paragraph, he cut it out. He had picked up exactly what I was doing. He knew that it was repetition, so we cut his 1,000 pages into 300, and the thing went into about 12 foreign editions, and it did extremely well.
What was it called?
It was called, much against my advice, it was called The Original Sin. And I thought, that's just not a good title. And but he was absolutely insistent, and then I said, well, just what do you mean by the original sin? What does it mean to you? And he said, it means the inability to love or be loved unconditionally. And I thought, well, that's very good, actually. So I put that in, and it was well received. But I think it told about his life. It only took him to the age of 21, but it was very successful commercially. Then the interesting thing is, and this is what Craig Pearson always liked, because he said that students came up to him, as they did to me, years after we helped them with Project Right, and they would say this was useful to them. This was the most useful thing they learned from Project Right. And that would happen when Little Brown, which had published this book by Quinn, they called me up and said, we have another project for you, and I said, what? And they said, Rex Harrison wants an editor. So we want to send you to London to meet with him at his home, and we'll send you to London and pay you nicely. And I asked for much more than I thought they'd give me, and they did. They gave it to me. So I went to see Rex Harrison, and how many of you know of Rex Harrison? Oh, you all know about Rex Harrison. Well, he lived in a palatial house, Georgian house, and when I walked in, I remember there were these pugs, they're called, I think. It's a dog that is just huge, and that just lies on the floor most of the time slobbering. I was just amazed. There were 6 or 7 of them. And I thought, what are we going to do? And, well, he sort of, that didn't bother him at all, you know. He was so used to them. But he said after a while, and he offered me a glass of sherry, which I took while he abstained. And this was in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. And so we chatted for a while, and he said, well, I hear you worked with Anthony Quinn on his book. And I said, yes. That was easy. We took 1,000 pages and cut it into 50. And he said, well, he said, here we have the opposite. I have 50, and we have to turn it into 1,000. And I said, not to worry. I said, it's called the Furnace Creek Inn. And Death Valley is about, I don't know, 2 hours out of Los Angeles, I think. And sounds awful, doesn't it, Death Valley? But it's actually very, very lovely. It's a little oasis in the desert there. And so we worked on the thing out there. And what was I telling you about earlier? Why did I
cliff.
think?
The cliff story.
The cliff
Oh,
story.
the cliffs, yes. So we would work every day, but around, after lunch, we would go tour. We'd visit whatever we wanted to. There's Scotty's Castle, some pioneer who lived there and collected all kinds of stuff and made a museum out of it. And there's a place where a crater, a meteor struck and left a great, great hole. Lots of interesting places to go. And so Quinn and his friend were way up high on this ridge, which they'd gotten to. And I said, well, come down. And they said, we can't. And I said, why not? They said, rocks start falling on us when we move. If we go up, they start falling on us from the top. And if you go down, they start falling on us. And they said, there are park rangers and so on. Tell them to get us out of here. Well, we were fortunate because the cars had practically all gone, but I did see one ranger's car. And so we explained the thing to them, and they said, well, this is a dangerous situation. It's a crisis. They could make it if they stumbled their way down, but they might also be smashed. So what we'll have to do is we will have to wend our way up and put pulleys up and rope and so on and so forth and let them down with a pulley. Well, this all took hours and hours, you know. And, but it was amazing. One by one they came down. And then Quinn, being, of course, embarrassed at having created this stir, asked the Rangers not to give this story to the press because he said they'll say Quinn couldn't hack it. You know? So they didn't, but he said, I want everybody here, because there were all these Rangers and other people, I want everyone to go to Furnace Creek, and it was midnight now, and we all have steak and baked potatoes and wine and cocktails. So it turned into a great, great feast, and everybody was just having a wonderful time. So what Marjorie Looney said later on was, she said, well, you know, being around Quinn can be challenging, she said. But she said, it's never a bore. And it wasn't. And by the way, about Fellini, the great Italian director, he told me this anecdote about him one time. He said they were filming this film called La Strada. Now, you won't have watched this. How many, you have seen La Strada? Oh, a lot of people have seen La Strada. Well, I'll be darned. Well, those who haven't, if you can get it on, you know, Netflix or whatever, get it, because it's a masterpiece.
Julieta Messina,
Julieta Messina,
his wife,
wife.
started.
Yeah.
It was her first big starring role.
Big starring role, and she became very famous. Well, she was wonderful in it. God, she was wonderful. And, but he told me that they were filming one night. The story is of a film plays this strong man, and that's kind of act that he goes around with. And Messina plays his, any other questions?
Sure.
Oh.
I don't know. Maybe people can hear without the mic, but my voice is softer. So you're in Amana,
Yeah.
Iowa, boy.
Yeah.
What was it like growing up there?
Heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Amana colonies. How many of you have been to the Amana colonies? A lot. Each day in the morning, the men would get their assignments to work in the farms, in the farm area, in the field. Or if there were some businesses, some of them tended the business. And the ladies all gathered around the kitchens and did the baking and the cooking and so on and so forth. And for a young kid, it was just wonderful, because here you had these interesting ladies sitting there shelling peas, telling story after story, and they would just love it if you came, and I would just sit down and start shelling peas with them, you know. And they just loved that, because then they could tell me stories, and then they could find out things about my family, probably, which I would tell them, not knowing that they might tell other people. But it was just fun, and this common. Then the men came and ate at the community kitchen, community dining hall, and it was a very, very simple rural way of life. And of course, we were in the country, and when you looked out your own window where we lived, there would be the cattle grazing, and sheep, and little streams, and a river running through forest from one end to the other. It was just a utopian spot. It was just gorgeous. It still is, but of course now it's also, before the Great Recession set in, 50,000 people, 50,000 people a week came to visit the Amanas. It's calmed down considerably because gasoline is so high. But it became, as a result of that, if you go to the main Amana now, you'll see a lot of shops, every sort of shop. Most of them have nothing to do with the Amanas. They're just geared toward tourists. But there's still wonderful things there. There's a woodworking shop. You can buy beautiful furniture, and a woolen mill, gorgeous woolens. So you can still there and see a lot of native crafts. And there are, of course, lots of restaurants. My family ran a restaurant for the community, a restaurant and a hotel. And so I grew up in that. And it was interesting because we were still, when I was growing up, we spoke German at home. Everyone spoke German. And I must tell you about my Aunt Emma. She, Aunt Emma was a dear, dear lady who just, she was a kind of saint. She loved in the morning, she would put on her bonnet, and when the sun went up, she was out in the garden. And she was planting flowers and trimming flowers. And she did that the entire day. She'd stop for lunch and stop for dinner, but that was the end of the day. And the people that came from nearby towns like Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, they all saw her in the garden and they'd start talking to her. And they all fell in love with her because she'd have just kind of little few English words. She would just respond with yes and no and ja, wahrscheinlich, ja, ein bisschen. She'd just use a word or two, and they'd try to gather what she meant. But she was just, they loved to see someone doing something that they loved. And she had this gift for, she had just one pot after another of flowers. It was just, it was so beautiful, our place. I mean, a hedge trimmed all the way, and apple trees, and pear trees, and plum trees, and cherry trees, and strawberries in season, and oh, it was just for a kid. And you know, you could climb trees, and it was just wonderful. But my Aunt Emma was the mistress of the kitchen, and she made the apple fritters herself. And she was so proud of them that she would carry them out to these people, and they would engage her in conversation because they liked her so much, and she kind of understood a little bit. And there were certain ones, when they came repeatedly, she would invite them to her room, to her little suite, and offer them a glass of the local wine. That was a big, big thing. That was a treat for only the very special ones. But I remember I would be there working in the kitchen and waiting on tables. And I remember seeing her, she had this table full of people trailing her through the kitchen, going to the room. And she looked at us, and she knew that the people didn't speak German, so she'd say, and the people were also smiling, just loving her and waiting for their little glass of wine. And she said to all of us, "Ach Gott, was ist das ein Elend? Oh God, what a headache this is." And then they would laugh and smile and she would, so that was Anne.
I have a question, Norman.
Oh yeah.
So, this,
Oh.
yeah, so this was when you finished high school in the Amanas,
Mm-hmm.
right? War came. You were drafted or just
I enlisted
volunteered?
in the Navy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then shortly after that, the war ended, and you went
The
off to
same
Harvard.
day that I enlisted, the war ended. I enlisted in the morning, and in the afternoon, the Japanese surrendered.
They were worried.
Yeah,
That was all it took. You were
that's all it took. The
fight.
news spread rapidly.
But how did that happen? Though you made the transition from this kid from a rural
Yeah.
heaven to going to Cambridge, and then from there on to Manhattan.
Yeah.
What was that like? I mean, what made you even think that that was something that you would want to do?
Odd, isn't it?
It is.
Yes. Well, for some reason, very young, I thought I'd like to be a writer. I had no idea why. No one in my family did anything like that. No one was in the theater. But when I was in school, I noticed that Theater Arts magazine was one of the magazines that they had, and I was somehow drawn to that. So it was just, there was something in past lives, maybe, that drew me to that. Anyhow, when I got to New York, I think I went to Europe first, I was in my 20s, and I remembered theater arts. And the first thing I did, this was in the 50s, by the way, the 1950s. And I called up Theater Arts and I said, I'd like to apply for a job. And the receptionist said, well, we don't have anything. What were you interested in, though? And I said, well, editorial, of course. And she said, no, definitely nothing in editorial. She said, sometimes the advertising director will see people, but he has nothing to offer in the way of a job either. And I said, well, I'd see him. And so I met this advertising director, whose name was Ellis Myers. And very, very nice man. And he had been on the ground floor of Playboy. He was the first advertising director of Playboy. And Hugh Hefner was, of course, the editor. And they did well for a while, and then they quarreled. And Hugh Hefner went on to great, great fame and fortune. And Ellis Myers went on to Little Theater Arts magazine, which was just struggling to keep its eyes open. And they didn't even have one single advertising salesman that they could offer a job to. But he said, well, call us next month and you never know, something might happen. And so I called the next month and he said, nothing, Norman. And he said, call again next month, and I called the next month. And I called for about 6 months. And the last time he said, Norman, it's good of you to call, but there's nothing happening here at all. Save your dime. That will tell you what's a dime phone at that time for a phone call. And so when the time came to make my call the next month, I thought, well, Ellis said not to bother. And I thought, well, it's only a dime. So I called up and he said, how fast can you get over here? And he hired me on the spot. And so I became the only advertising salesman. And about 6 months later, Theater Arts was sold to a different group. And the first thing they did was to fire the man that had hired me, Alice Myers, because he was still having this fairly high salary that he insisted on because he had been with Playboy in its heyday. And so they asked him, they said, we can't, afford you. Do you have anyone around that you could recommend? And gosh, he pointed to me, to my surprise, and said, I think Norman would do just fine. So I became the advertising director. My background was just the Amana colonies, so waiting on tables. And here I was, the advertising director, and people were always quite astonished that I'd made it so fast. In 6 months, I'd become the advertising manager of Theater Arts, the leading theater magazine in the world, by the way. Not a huge circulation. But then the new owners said, Mr. Zierold, they said, we've been here now for 6 months, and the advertising has improved a little bit, but not very much, And they said, what's holding it up? And I said, well, the circulation, is not very large. Advertisers want a big circulation. They don't want just, we've got 30,000. Well, they said, would you take over advertising? And I said, well, of course. So they made me also circulation director. And in about 6 months, this story repeated itself because the circulation hadn't grown up a great deal. And so they said, what is holding up the circulation and the advertising? And I said, well, I'm afraid it's the editorial. And believe it or not, I became the editorial. Well, it was a lot of fun. And it went on for a couple of years, and I was the editorial director of the magazine, and it was just a fabulous time. I really I didn't like to wait. I didn't like to leave the office in the evening, and I couldn't wait to get there in the morning. So that was a halcyon period of my life. But then the magazine was sold again, and we were all fired. And fortunately, I got another job. But that was the end of Theater Arts. And the new group didn't know what to do with it. They were just inept, and it went out of business. Too bad.
So,
yeah,
you were able to witness some iconic moments in, I guess, Hollywood history, or maybe just American history. Like, were you present when Marilyn Monroe sang "Happy Birthday" to President Kennedy?
I actually was, yes.
Tell us a little
Yeah.
about that, yeah.
Yeah, that was New York, 1962, as I remember. And I do tell about that in the book. Peter Lawford was the master of ceremonies, at least during that part. And I remember they started doing that "Happy Birthday" refrain, and Peter Lawford said, "And here she comes, the one, the only, the magnificent," the way they do, and nobody showed up at all, and Marilyn was known for not showing, of course, and so and he said, "But meanwhile we'll have Liza Minnelli or whoever it was, So they had some other people performing, and now I think I get a signal that the moment has come for the one, the only, the effervescent, the never to be forgotten if we ever see her, Marilyn," and then no one showed up. And then finally, in another act, And that went on for quite a while. And then again, Peter said, and now, for, and he said, and then there was just total silence, because slowly out of the corner of the stage came Marilyn Monroe, in a sequin dress that was just a wonder to the eye. And she slithered across the stage to the microphone and sort of breathed. And it was magical. It was absolutely magical. I mean, no one who was there ever will ever forget it. And I did. What I remembered, though, was I was a great and am a great Jimmy Durante fan. And Jimmy Durante, of that era, we knew through the radio. He had a radio show, and it was famous because he always ended it by saying, "Good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are." And nobody knew who Mrs. Calabash was. And he kept saying that every time. "Good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are." He had that raspy voice. And he said, when people would ask him, he'd say, "Well, you know, there has to be some mystery left in life." So I remember when he came out, that was a big, big moment for me. And he did a couple of numbers. And he played the piano for himself. And then he did this extraordinary thing. You know, the Madison Square Garden was all four sides. And at that point, when he was, I don't know what word, I had never been interested in this discussion about duality and unity and so on and so forth. I didn't understand anything of that. So I was never particularly interested in exploring those areas until after Theater Arts and Show Magazine ended. I moved to California and to a tiny little village called Laguna Beach, which is just as gorgeous as anything can be in this world. And one day I saw a poster on a telephone pole, and it said, "Transcendental Meditation, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi." And I thought, well, I don't know anything about it. It might be interesting. And I thought, maybe I'm busy that evening, but I'm not busy. I have nothing to do. I have just moved here. I'm free every night for the rest of my life. So I looked, and it was just a week away, the talk, and I thought I'd go to that. And, I did go to that. Someone gave them a room. And I learned, and I thought it was very pleasant, and I did it every day. And I thought, nice enough, doing very well. And nothing extraordinary. I didn't feel like David Lynch did that I'd been on an elevator and someone had cut the cable, which, if I'd heard it, would have been wonderful. But I persevered, so I must have enjoyed it to some degree. And then I was invited by this friend in whose house I'd been taught for a weekend course, and it was in a local, it was in a little monastery, probably not there anymore. And I went for this weekend, and I remember being very, when I went there, it was a very nice little dining room and a very nice little monastic area. And I remember just sitting down at this little table and this thing. And here were these nice ladies sitting there, and I had a conversation with them, and I thought, this is not the right time. So I just wrote with that, and after that, I wrote every single person that I knew in the world and told them to start meditating. And I even wrote people that I admired, like people that I hadn't met at that time, by the way, but that I did meet later on. Curiously enough, I hadn't even thought of it. But I wrote people like Tennessee Williams and Edward Albee, little notes saying I admired their writing so much that I wanted them to know about something wonderful in life, and would they look into TM? And I gave them a clipping from the New York Times, I think at the time. And I never heard from them or anything, but I didn't expect to. But that's how I felt about it. I just wanted everybody to start. And a lot of people that I chloroformed did start. No, it was really wonderful, wonderful time. So that's how nature organized that. I think all of you have had individual experiences that were different from everyone else's, but that was mine. And I had other epiphanies like that along the road, which were wonderful. But that was of course. That was I'm sure was it. It was a very, very pleasant course.
Yes, it's a life changer for me too.
Oh, very, very good.
I married her 2 years later.
Oh, well. You see, I just missed out on that. Yes.
Did you, in a book you mentioned Henry James.
Yes.
Did you have a chance to meet him?
No, he died. He was a little earlier than my period. I think he died. Or should we just? What should we do? Hey.
I think it'd be great if people could have an opportunity to buy a book, if there's somebody that can do that for you.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So let's do that so that. Okie doke.
We do have some refreshments over there as well, and some cookies and some more cookies. So
Yeah.
help yourself.
That's wonderful,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Norman.
My pleasure.
And
Karusha.
I'd just like to say that this was our first event with the new carpet, and yes, and we'll be having a special event just to celebrate the carpet.
Hey Norman, did you read the Steve Jobs biography?
No, I
Yeah,
haven't.
you should read that.
I think so.
It's extremely readable. The guy, you know, who wrote it used to be
Isaacson, he's a noted.
Isaacson. Yeah.
He's a
very
noted
good.
guy.
He's a good writer. It's very informal. You know, it reads it very smoothly. I can see.
Oh, yeah.
And there's no pretension or anything. It's just like telling a story.
Well, he's done it many, many
Yeah.
times.
Well, he wrote the one on Benjamin Franklin
Stars,
that I read.
Anthony
that I thought
Yeah,
was
I've read him
amazing.
too on something else.
who
I
else?
Yeah,
can't-
and you read one on. I did one on Einstein.
Oh, yeah.
Another-
But anyway,
Mostly it was
yeah,
Anthony
you should
Quinn
read
type.
that because
I
it's
think
really,
you're right.
it really opens your eyes to Silicon Valley.
I'm glad you reminded me
I
of
think he
that,
has
because
a
I
lot
was
about
thinking
him in
of
the
it.
book.
Yeah, and they've got like 4 or 5 copies. Of it.
Fantastic.
pleasure to
Hey,
see
listen, can we have you over sometime?
Oh, yeah.
It'd be fun.
Sure.
You know, it'd be a very fun thing if you